It was an ordinary morning when the world began to change. As the first rays of sunlight spilled over the high school campus, it felt like any other day. Teenagers were already arriving in their usual groups, some chatting excitedly about the weekend, while others rushed to their classes, still half asleep. The hum of the school bell rang through the air, signaling the start of another day of lessons. No one had the slightest inkling that by the end of the day, their lives would be irrevocably altered. At the center of the school was Emma, a quiet but determined senior who had always kept to herself. She had no idea that she'd soon be thrust into a leadership role that would test her in ways she couldn't possibly have imagined. As she walked down the hallway, her mind wandered to the upcoming college applications, not at all focused on the strange news reports she had heard earlier in the morning. There had been talk of outbreaks, violent attacks, and strange behavior among people in distant cities, but those were just rumors, right? But then, the first scream cut through the air. Emma froze in her tracks. It came from down the hall, near the gym. A few students turned their heads, confused, as the echo of terror bounced off the walls. More screams followed, frantic and raw with panic. Emma's heart raced, and instinctively, she rushed toward the source of the noise. The hallway was quickly filling with students, their faces painted with confusion, fear, and curiosity. But something in the air felt off, like a storm was brewing just beyond the horizon. As she neared the gym doors, she saw the first signs of horror. A teacher, Mr. Jenkins, lay sprawled across the floor, his eyes wide open but glazed over, as if life had been drained from him. Another student, Carl, was standing over him, but his movements weren't normal. His body jerked and swayed in an unnatural way, like he was fighting for control. Blood dripped from his mouth, and his clothes were torn. "Carl," someone shouted, but the sound was drowned out by the unearthly growl that came from Carl's throat. His eyes locked onto the nearest student, a look of hunger and rage flashing across his face before he lunged. Pandemonium erupted in the hallway. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she watched Carl attack one of his classmates. She had seen enough movies to know what was happening, but seeing it in real life was something entirely different. The grotesque tearing of flesh, the screams, the wild thrashing, it was beyond anything she could have imagined. The school bell rang again, but this time, it was drowned by the sounds of chaos. Students scattered in every direction, some sprinting toward the exits, others huddling in corners, unsure of what to do. Emma's mind raced. This wasn't just an outbreak, it was something far worse. The world outside was crumbling, and they were stuck inside, isolated from everything they once knew. Without thinking, Emma rushed into the gym, instinctively pulling the door closed behind her. The gym was already a scene of madness. Several students were backed into corners, their eyes wild with fear, trying to figure out what to do next. Coach Daniels, usually a pillar of strength, was now cowering near the bleachers, his face pale. He looked up when Emma entered. "It's happening," he whispered, his voice shaking. "The virus, it's here." Emma's thoughts scrambled. Was it some kind of virus? Was it airborne, like the news reports had hinted? Or was it something else entirely? She didn't have time to ponder the possibilities as more students started pouring into the gym, all trying to find refuge. "Where's the principal?" Emma asked. "Gone. Took some of the teachers and left." "Left us here," Coach Daniels replied, his voice barely audible. "We're on our own." Emma didn't know what to think. The walls seemed to close in around her as the noise outside the gym grew louder, the sounds of screams and growls filling the air. A sense of dread swept over the students who had gathered. It wasn't just a few people out there. It was everyone. The school was surrounded, and there was nowhere to run. "Listen up," Emma shouted, her voice cutting through the panic. She wasn't sure where the strength came from, but it was there, and it filled her with a sense of urgency. "We need to fortify this place. We need to lock every door, every window. And we need to stay together." The students looked at each other, uncertain. Fear still gripped them, but Emma's words seemed to reach them. Slowly, they began to nod. Some of them moved toward the windows, while others headed for the lockers, searching for anything they could use to barricade the doors. Emma turned to Coach Daniels. "We need a plan. A real plan." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I think it's time to stop thinking of this as a lockdown. This is survival." And just like that, the school that once felt like a safe space, a sanctuary for learning, became their fortress. But little did they know, the real battle had only just begun. The students would have to fight not just for their lives, but for their humanity. And as Emma looked around at the faces of her classmates, she realized the world she knew was gone forever. The only question left was, could they survive what was coming next? The gym was chaotic, but Emma's mind was focused. Her instincts were sharp, and she knew that the first step in survival was securing their surroundings. She had to take charge, there was no time for doubt. As students hurried to barricade the doors and windows, Emma scanned the room for anything that could be used as weapons or tools. Coach Daniels, despite his obvious fear, had become a reluctant leader, offering advice on what to do next. "We need to reinforce the doors," Coach Daniels said, his voice steadier than before. "Make sure everything's locked tight. We don't know how many of them are out there." Emma nodded and turned to the group. "Everyone, listen up. Find anything that can be used to block doors or windows. We need to make this place impenetrable. Don't leave anyone alone. We're stronger together." The students, still terrified, began to move with a sense of urgency. They were scared, but they were also determined. The reality of their situation was sinking in. They weren't just dealing with some kind of violent outbreak. This was something far worse, something that could end the world as they knew it. Emma walked over to the nearest student, a shy freshman named Jake, who was holding a broomstick in his hands. He was shaking, but his eyes had a spark of defiance in them. "Jake, help me move these chairs over to the door," she said, gesturing to the gym's main entrance. He nodded, and together, they began to drag the heavy chairs across the floor. The sound of scraping metal was jarring, but they didn't care. Every inch of space that was sealed off felt like a small victory against the unknown horrors outside. As they worked, Emma heard the distant sound of sirens, faint but persistent. They were coming from outside the school, but it was unclear if they were for help or a desperate attempt to contain the chaos. Emma couldn't afford to waste time wondering. She had to focus on what she could control. The gym doors were now secured, and the windows were covered with anything they could find. Desks, gym mats, and even the basketball hoops net had been used to block the view from the outside. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do for now. Coach Daniels had organized a small group to check the rest of the school. They would make sure that all exits were secured and that no one had been left behind. Meanwhile, Emma took charge of the students who remained. They were huddled together, some still too frightened to speak, others too stunned to move. She knew she had to do something to rally them. "Listen," Emma said, raising her voice so everyone could hear her. "I know this is terrifying. We don't know what's going on out there, but right now, this gym is the safest place for us. We're not going to just wait here and let this happen to us. We're going to survive. Together." A few of the students nodded, but many of them still looked unsure. It was hard to blame them. How could anyone be sure of anything in a situation like this? As the minutes passed, the sounds from outside grew louder. More screams, more growls. The air was thick with tension, and the students grew restless. Emma's thoughts raced, but she couldn't afford to show any fear. She had to keep everyone focused. Suddenly, the door to the gym swung open, and Coach Daniels stumbled in, his face pale. He was out of breath, and his eyes were wide with alarm. "It's worse than we thought," he gasped. "The hallways are full of them. We've got to move. Now." Emma's heart sank. She hadn't wanted to believe it, but now she was forced to confront the terrifying reality. The school was overrun. There was no escaping it. They were trapped. "We need a plan," Emma said quickly. "Coach, how many of them are out there? Can we fight our way through?" Coach Daniels shook his head. "There's too many. We'd be walking straight into a nightmare. Our only option is to stay put and wait for help. But what if help never comes? Emma asked, her voice tight with urgency. What if we're the only ones left? The room fell silent at her words. It was a sobering thought, and no one wanted to entertain it, but deep down, they all knew it was a possibility. Then we fight, she said, her voice low but filled with determination. We fortify this place even more, and we wait for the right moment to make our move. We don't give up. Not now. The students exchanged looks. There was still fear in their eyes, but Emma's words had struck a chord. They were no longer just victims in a world falling apart, they were survivors. And survivors fought. What about supplies? One of the students, Lily, asked. Food, water, medicine. We'll need all of it if we're going to last. Emma nodded. We'll need to gather everything we can from the classrooms and the cafeteria. We'll make a supply run when it's safe. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was all they had. The gym was their fortress now, and every decision they made from here on out would be critical. Emma took a deep breath and looked around at her classmates. They were scared, but they were also determined. They would survive, not just because they had to, but because they weren't going to let this world take them without a fight. The school had become their battleground, and the war was just beginning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the school transformed into a shadow of its former self. The bright, vibrant hallways now felt dark and oppressive, a far cry from the bustling, carefree atmosphere they had once held. The distant sounds of the city, sirens, screams, and the occasional explosion, reminded everyone that the world outside had descended into chaos. Inside, however, the students were beginning to settle into their new reality. It had been hours since Coach Daniels and his group had returned from their sweep of the school, and now, the gym was eerily silent. The barricades had been reinforced, the windows covered, and every door locked tight. But even in the relative safety of their makeshift fortress, the sense of impending doom hung heavy in the air. Emma could feel it in her bones, the constant buzzing in the back of her mind, the unsettling fear that they might not be safe after all. The group had begun to organize. Some students had taken charge of gathering supplies from the school's kitchen and classrooms, while others were assigned to keep watch, making sure the perimeter remained secure. Emma had chosen a small group to help with the makeshift weapons, anything that could be used for self-defense if the worst happened. As Emma surveyed the room, her mind raced. They had no idea how long they would have to stay here. There were no guarantees of rescue, no promises that anyone was coming for them. They were on their own. Okay, we need to talk about our next steps, Emma said, standing in front of the small group of students she had gathered. The doors are locked, the windows are covered, but we need to plan for the long term. We can't survive like this forever. Jake, the freshman who had helped barricade the gym earlier, raised his hand. What if we get more supplies? There's a storage closet in the back of the school with extra food and water. We could go out and grab what we can. Emma's heart skipped a beat. You want to go outside? Jake nodded, his eyes wide with determination. It's the only way we can last. We can't survive on what we have now. Emma weighed the idea. Jake was right, they needed more supplies, but the danger of stepping outside was real. The horde of infected, if that's what they were, would be waiting. She wasn't sure if the group could survive another encounter. We can't go out there blindly, she said, her voice steady. We'll make a plan first. We'll scout the hallways and see if the way is clear. If it's not, we stay here and wait for the right moment. The students nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. What about weapons? Lily, another student who had been with Emma from the beginning, asked. If we're going out there, we need something to defend ourselves. Emma looked around at the makeshift weapons they had gathered so far, broomsticks, metal pipes, and broken chairs. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Everyone grab what you can, Emma said. We'll meet back here in an hour to plan the route. Stay sharp. The group dispersed to gather weapons and supplies, and Emma took a moment to check on the others. The gym had become a strange mix of a refuge and a prison. The students had formed smaller groups, talking quietly amongst themselves, but the tension was palpable. The thought of venturing outside, where the infected could be lurking, was terrifying. Still, they couldn't afford to sit idly by. They had to act. The evening stretched on, and soon it was dark. The school's lights flickered on and off, casting eerie shadows across the gym. Emma tried to keep her thoughts focused, but the unsettling feeling gnawed at her. Was the situation growing worse outside? Were more of the infected gathering? Or was it just her mind playing tricks on her? "Emma, over here." It was Coach Daniels, and he was standing near the back of the gym, away from the others. She walked over, her heart pounding. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice low. Coach Daniels looked grim. "I checked the cameras. The main entrance is swarming. They've breached the front gate." Emma's stomach dropped. The thought of the infected getting closer to their safe zone was enough to make her breath catch in her throat. "So what does that mean for us?" she asked. "It means we need to stay even more alert. We need to keep our eyes on every exit," he said, his tone serious. "I don't want anyone going out there unless we absolutely have to." Emma nodded, but deep down, she knew the truth: they couldn't stay inside forever. Sooner or later, the infected would find their way in. The school had become a ticking time bomb, and they were running out of time. "All right," Emma said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We stick to the plan. We'll go out at first light and see if we can grab what we need. But we do it carefully. No unnecessary risks." Coach Daniels clapped her on the shoulder. "You're doing a great job, Emma. Don't let the fear control you. We'll get through this." She forced a small smile, grateful for the encouragement, but she knew this was just the beginning. The world outside was descending into chaos, and there was no telling how long they could hold out. As the night wore on, the group gathered in the center of the gym, keeping a watchful eye on the door and windows. The sounds from outside had grown more intense, but Emma refused to let the fear consume her. They were going to survive. They had to. The first night in their new fortress passed slowly, each hour dragging on, but Emma stayed vigilant. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but as long as they stuck together, there was still hope. And somewhere deep inside, Emma knew that the fight for survival was just beginning. The morning came slowly, the sun barely cresting the horizon. Emma woke up to the sound of hushed whispers and shifting bodies around the gym. The air was thick with the tension of what lay ahead. They had spent the night awake, taking shifts to keep watch, and now, with the day dawning, it was time to take action. The plan was simple, but dangerous: they would venture outside the gym to gather whatever supplies they could find. It was a risk, but one they had no choice but to take. They couldn't survive on what little food and water they had scavenged. Emma looked around the gym at the tired faces of her classmates. They were scared, but determination had set in. They were ready to fight for their survival. "Okay," Emma said, standing up and addressing the group. "We're going to stick to the plan. We move quickly, and we stay together. No one goes off on their own." Coach Daniels stood beside her, his face grim but resolute. "I'll take point," he said. "I know the layout of the school better than most of you. I'll lead the way. Emma, you and Lily keep watch behind." Emma nodded, then turned to the others. "The rest of you, stay in the middle. If anything happens, we regroup here in the gym. Don't try to fight them off if we run into trouble. Just get back here as fast as you can." There were murmurs of agreement as the group gathered their makeshift weapons and checked their supplies. Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but she knew that every step they took outside of their temporary fortress could be their last. "All right," Emma said, taking a deep breath. "Let's go." The group moved silently through the hallways, their footsteps soft against the cold floor. The school felt unnaturally quiet now, the normal sounds of students and teachers replaced by an eerie stillness. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she walked beside Coach Daniels. Each corner they rounded felt like a step further into the unknown. As they approached the cafeteria, Coach Daniels held up his hand, signaling for the group to stop. He peered around the corner cautiously. "It's clear," he whispered, then motioned for them to follow. The cafeteria was quiet, the tables and chairs scattered around like a forgotten memory of normal school life. A few abandoned lunch trays lay on the floor, the food long since spoiled. The only sounds were their breathing and the faint hum of the emergency lights overhead. "Start grabbing anything you can," Emma said, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "Cans of food, water bottles, anything that'll last." The group scattered, each person quickly filling bags with whatever they could find. Emma grabbed a few cans of soup and some bottled water, then turned her attention to the shelves. Her hands trembled as she reached for a first aid kit, her mind racing with the thought of how easily their supplies could run out. "Check the back freezer," Lily said, her voice low. "There might be more food in there." Emma nodded and headed toward the kitchen, pushing open the heavy door to the storage area. The freezer was still functional, its contents mostly frozen meat, vegetables, and frozen meals. It wasn't much, but it would help them get by for a while. Emma loaded as much as she could carry into her bag, trying to ignore the gnawing fear in her chest. When she turned to leave, however, the sound of a low growl stopped her in her tracks. Her heart skipped a beat. The sound was unmistakable. "Emma!" Lily's voice came from the cafeteria, panic lacing her tone. "They're here!" Emma's blood ran cold as she dashed back to the cafeteria. She rounded the corner just in time to see one of the infected, no, not just one, at least 3 of them stumbling into the room. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, their eyes glassy with hunger. The smell of decay filled the air as they shuffled closer, drawn by the scent of the students. Coach Daniels immediately stepped forward, gripping a broken broomstick. "Get back," he shouted, his voice steady, but his hands were shaking. "Don't engage unless you have to." Emma's instincts kicked in. "Back to the gym, now," she shouted to the others. The students froze, but they quickly snapped out of their daze and began to retreat. Emma grabbed Lily's arm and pulled her toward the exit. The infected were closing in fast, and Emma knew they didn't have much time. Coach Daniels swung his broomstick with precision, knocking one of the infected off balance. The others hissed and lunged, but Coach Daniels was already backing up toward the door. "Hurry up," he shouted. Emma and the others ran as fast as they could, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Behind them, the infected shrieked and howled, but Emma dared not look back. They had to keep moving. The group reached the gym doors, and Coach Daniels slammed them shut behind them, locking them as quickly as he could. Breathing heavily, Emma turned to face the others. "Everyone okay?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. The group nodded, though their faces were pale with fear. They had made it back, but barely. "That was too close," Lily whispered, her hand trembling as she held a bag of supplies. Emma looked at the others, her heart heavy. "We need to stay sharp," she said. "We can't keep going out there like this. From now on, we move as a unit, and we don't take chances." The gym, once a place of safety, now felt like a cage. The infected were close. The school was no longer a sanctuary, it was just another battleground in a world that had been consumed by chaos. And they were stuck in the middle of it, fighting for survival. The day had been a reminder of just how quickly their situation could change. They had gotten supplies, but they had also seen the price of making even the smallest mistake. There was no room for error now. The fortress was fragile, and every day they spent inside it brought them closer to the edge. Emma couldn't help but wonder, how long could they hold out before the walls came crashing down? The school, once a place of structure and routine, had become a prison. Days blurred together, the sense of time slipping away as the group of teenagers tried to adapt to their new reality. What had started as a temporary refuge was now a fragile stronghold against the chaos outside. But every passing hour brought a new danger. Emma paced the gymnasium floor, her eyes scanning the makeshift barricades they'd built around the windows. The walls of the school had once offered protection, but now, they felt more like a tomb. They were surrounded by infected, and no one knew how long it would be before the school was overrun. Has anyone heard from the others? Emma asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Coach Daniels, who had been stationed by the door, looked up. Nothing on the radio. I think we're on our own. Emma nodded grimly. The idea that no one else might be out there, that the world had completely collapsed, felt too heavy to grasp. But the evidence was undeniable. The horde was growing larger, more relentless by the day. They could no longer count on anyone to rescue them. It was up to them, and only them, to survive. Maybe it's time we make a plan, Jake spoke up from his spot near the corner of the gym. He had become more assertive in recent days, his usual shyness replaced by a grim determination. We can't just keep hiding here. Emma paused, considering his words. Jake wasn't wrong. Staying put might have been the best option at first, but it was becoming more clear by the hour that they couldn't simply remain locked in the gym forever. We need more supplies, Lily added, looking at Emma with wide, worried eyes. We can't keep eating canned food and frozen meals. We're going to run out of everything soon. I know, Emma replied, her tone heavy. But going outside is dangerous. The infected are everywhere, and we don't have the manpower to fight them off if they get inside. A heavy silence hung in the air as the group exchanged uneasy glances. The decision to venture out was no longer just a matter of necessity, it was a matter of survival. They couldn't stay here forever. But the thought of facing the infected in the open, without the safety of the school walls, was terrifying. We don't have a choice, Coach Daniels said after a long pause, his voice steely. We need to find a way to fortify this place, but we can't do it on what little we have. We need to take the fight to them. We need to clear the way for better supplies. Emma's stomach churned. It was one thing to take a few risks, but another to actively confront the danger head-on. Still, she knew he was right. The group couldn't afford to wait for things to get better. If they wanted a real chance at survival, they would have to be proactive. We'll plan a route, Emma said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. But we'll do it smart. We'll keep to the halls we know are clear. We'll only go after what we absolutely need. We can't carry much, Lily warned. If we're going to make it back in one piece, we have to be careful. Emma nodded. I'll organize the groups. We'll take 2 teams. One for supplies, the other for securing more barricades. She began to move around the gym, assigning each of the students a role. Jake and Lily would go for food and water, and Coach Daniels would lead a small group to reinforce the school's main entrance. Emma herself would lead the team securing additional barricades and weapons from the classrooms. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew how dangerous this would be. The infected had already begun to gather outside, banging against the windows, clawing at the walls. They were getting closer. With everything set, the teams prepared to move out. The gym doors creaked open, and the group slipped into the dimly lit hallway, their footsteps muffled by the thick silence. Emma's heart raced, each beat reverberating in her chest. The school was eerily quiet, save for the distant growls of the infected outside. It felt like a fragile bubble waiting to burst. The hallway seemed endless, the shadows in the corners deepening as they passed. Emma's eyes flickered nervously over her shoulder, scanning for any sign of movement. She had never seen the school this still. Even the usual creaks of the building were gone, replaced by the unsettling silence. Emma, Jake's voice came in a hushed whisper. I think we're being watched. Emma held her breath, instinctively stopping. The air was thick with tension. She nodded for Jake and Lily to move closer, and the group paused, listening. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Emma saw something move. It was quick, too quick. A flash of dark figures darting between classrooms. Her heart skipped. Infected, Coach Daniels muttered. Stay quiet. We don't want to draw attention. They waited, holding their breath, hearts pounding in their chests as the figures passed. Emma motioned for the group to move again, her body tense as she led them down the hallway, closer to the main entrance. The infected outside were still banging at the gates, but the more they got closer to the school's exterior, the more Emma noticed something disturbing. There were more infected than she had anticipated. The horde had grown. "Why are they all gathered here?" Lily whispered, peering out a window at the mass of undead that surrounded the gates. It was as if they were waiting, coordinated, driven by some kind of instinct. Emma didn't have an answer. But she had a feeling that this was only the beginning of the storm. They were no longer in a race against time, they were in a battle for survival. And the stakes had just gotten much higher. The outside world had changed beyond recognition. What was once a bustling community of schools, businesses, and homes had now become a hostile wasteland filled with the relentless march of the infected. But in the safety of their school, Emma and her friends had created a fragile sanctuary, one that could not hold indefinitely. The moment the group had begun securing the school's barricades, the infected had reacted. It was as though they had sensed the shift, the vulnerability that came with the humans' attempt to reinforce their defenses. The growling, the pounding at the windows, it was louder than ever before. Emma paced the gym again, watching as the others worked to secure the remaining entrances. Coach Daniels, grim as ever, was checking the school's perimeter. The tension was thick in the air. It was clear to everyone now that it was no longer just about surviving the occasional ambush. The infected were gathering, pushing against the walls. The horde was closing in. "Emma," Jake called from across the gym. "You need to see this." She hurried over to him, her heart beating faster. Jake was looking through a crack in one of the boarded-up windows. His face was pale, his hand trembling as he pointed outside. Emma's gaze followed. Her stomach dropped. The infected were massing at the gates, but not just in a random, chaotic way. They were lined up. Almost methodical. A perfect wall of bodies, an overwhelming force that pressed against the barricades, testing their strength. "They're organized," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. She could barely believe what she was seeing. The infected weren't just aimlessly roaming anymore, they were gathering, like they knew exactly where to go. "What are they doing?" Lily asked, joining them at the window. "I don't know," Emma said. "But we need to act quickly. They're getting smarter." Coach Daniels approached from behind, his expression hard. "We've got a problem. The north entrance is weakening. We don't have much time before they break through." The group went silent, the weight of their situation sinking in. It wasn't just about gathering supplies anymore, it was about holding their ground. The school's walls were no longer their safe haven. The infected were closing in, and it felt like it was only a matter of time before they would be overwhelmed. "We need to double down on our defenses," Coach Daniels said firmly. "I'm going to the roof to get a better vantage point. He looked at Emma and the others, stay on the ground floor. We need to make sure every door is sealed." Emma nodded, her mind racing. It was a harsh realization, they weren't going to be able to wait this out. The siege had begun. As the group worked, the air grew thick with anticipation. The thud of footsteps, the cries of the infected outside, it was all they could hear. Emma glanced up, her mind drifting. It was surreal how quickly everything had shifted from being a temporary refuge to a war zone. Their old lives, their hopes for rescue, seemed like a distant memory. "You hear that?" Jake asked suddenly, his voice strained. Emma's breath hitched. For a split second, there was silence. Then, it came again, an unmistakable noise. A loud crash, followed by several more, rattling the building. "They're inside!" Lily shouted. The panic spread like wildfire. The barricades on the north entrance had finally given way. Emma turned to Coach Daniels, who was already heading toward the door, his face set with determination. "I'll hold them off," Coach Daniels said, his voice low. "You get everyone to the cafeteria. It's the most fortified area." "No," Emma said quickly, shaking her head. "We're not abandoning the gym. Not yet. We don't have a choice," Coach Daniels insisted, his tone final. "This is our only chance. If we stay here, we'll be trapped." Emma's eyes locked with his, and for a moment, she saw the resolve in his gaze. He was right, but it didn't make the decision any easier. The gym had been their sanctuary, their place of safety. The thought of leaving it behind felt like giving up. "Coach is right," Jake said, stepping forward. "We've got to move. If we don't, we'll be stuck here with nowhere to go." Reluctantly, Emma nodded. The plan was clear now. They had to leave their original fortress and move to another. But even as she turned toward the gym door, a fresh wave of panic hit her. They couldn't just leave the gym. They couldn't leave all their supplies behind. "We'll take what we can carry," Emma said quickly, grabbing her bag. "But we have to move fast." They rushed to gather whatever they could carry, but the sound of the infected getting closer made it clear that there was no time for careful packing. Emma stuffed a few cans of food and a first aid kit into her backpack, her hands shaking. She glanced at the others, Lily, Jake, and the rest of the group, all of them moving in a flurry of activity. It wasn't just the infected they had to worry about now. There was something else, something darker. The infected were relentless, but as Emma glanced at the door to the gym, she saw the glint of something much more frightening: desperation. The humans inside the horde were starting to break through their own boundaries. And that meant that soon, it wouldn't just be the undead they had to escape. "Let's go!" Emma shouted. The group moved quickly, slipping out of the gym, their footsteps echoing as they made their way through the halls. Behind them, the gym doors were battered with the force of the infected pressing against them. The walls that had once given them a sense of security were now a threat. They reached the cafeteria, and Emma locked the doors behind them. For now, they were safe. But the pressure was mounting. The siege was in full force, and the horde was growing stronger. They could hear the pounding of fists and the moans from just beyond the windows. The infected had breached their last line of defense, and the clock was ticking. But Emma refused to let fear take control. They had made it this far, and they weren't going down without a fight. She turned to face the group, determination burning in her eyes. "We hold here," she said, her voice steady. "This is our last stand." The cafeteria, with its large windows and fortified walls, was the last refuge. The group had settled in, doing what they could to fortify the room further. The infected were out there, scratching at the walls, trying to break through the barricades. But for the moment, the building had held. Emma stood near the door, listening. The pounding outside had intensified, as if the infected were becoming more determined, driven by an insatiable hunger. She had always thought of the cafeteria as just another part of the school. Now, it felt like a lifeline, or a trap. Coach Daniels had climbed to the roof to get a better view, and Emma had taken charge of the room, trying to keep the morale high. Everyone was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The constant fear, the weight of responsibility, it was taking a toll. Jake came up to her, a worried look on his face. "Emma, what's the plan? How long can we keep holding them off like this?" Emma didn't have an answer. Every part of her wanted to tell Jake that they had a chance, that rescue would come, or that something would happen to break the siege. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the truth. They were alone now. This wasn't some temporary struggle, it was survival, plain and simple. "We need to take back control," Emma said finally, her voice low but resolute. "We can't just sit here and wait. They're closing in. Sooner or later, they'll break through." "We can't go outside," Lily interjected, her voice shaking. "It's too risky. We don't know what we're facing." "I know. But we can't stay in here forever, either. We need a plan to clear the way." Emma's gaze hardened. "The infected are getting smarter. We need to move fast before they surround us." Coach Daniels returned to the group, his face grim. "The perimeter's getting worse. The infected are massing at every exit. We're going to have to push them back, or we won't have a choice but to fight our way out." Emma nodded, her chest tightening. The moment had arrived. They had to act, before the school became their tomb. "We've got one shot at this," Emma said, gathering the group's attention. "We'll divide into teams. One team will stay here and keep the barricades secure. The rest of us will push through the front exit. We have to clear the way and secure another route out. We're running out of supplies, and we need to make sure we have an escape route." Lily looked terrified. "But what if we don't make it back?" Emma met her gaze, her expression hard. "If we don't take action, we're already dead. We can't wait for a miracle. We have to make our own." Coach Daniels placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. "She's right. We fight now, or we don't fight at all." The weight of the decision settled heavily on Emma's shoulders. The plans, the preparations, the hours spent hiding, they had all led to this moment. They had no choice. The infected were pushing against the barricades with increasing ferocity, and the school's walls were starting to show signs of wear. The sound of their growls filled the hallways, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond their defenses. "We'll need weapons," Coach Daniels said, his eyes scanning the room. "The gymnasium is the best place to grab some. I'll go with Jake and get whatever we can." Emma nodded. She had already made a mental list of what they needed: bats, pipes, anything that could help them fight their way through the front. "Lily, you stay with me. Help reinforce the barricades here. We need to make sure the door holds while the others are gone." Lily didn't protest. She understood. As Coach Daniels and Jake slipped out of the cafeteria, Emma turned to the others. "This is it, everyone. Keep your wits about you. Stay quiet, stay focused. We've made it this far. We can survive this." But even as she said the words, the pounding from outside grew louder. The infected were getting closer, and Emma could feel the pressure mounting. The school had been their fortress, but the walls were crumbling. They had to push through the chaos or risk being overwhelmed. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they waited. Each minute felt like it might be their last, with the sounds of the infected growing louder and louder. Emma clenched her fists, every muscle in her body coiled with tension. Finally, Coach Daniels and Jake returned, their arms laden with improvised weapons, pipes, broken broom handles, and even a couple of baseball bats. Their faces were grim, but they had what they needed. "It's now or never," Coach Daniels said, handing Emma a pipe. "Let's clear a path." Without another word, the group moved out. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she led the way through the halls, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the tension that hung in the air. The main entrance was just ahead, the barricade holding, but it was shaking under the force of the infected trying to break through. "Get ready," Emma said, her voice barely audible. She turned to Coach Daniels and Jake. "On my mark." The moments stretched like an eternity before Emma gave the signal. With a single, decisive push, the barricade gave way. The door exploded open, and a flood of infected surged into the hallway. "Fight!" Emma shouted. We pushed them back. The sound of shuffling feet, growls, and screams filled the air. Emma swung the pipe with everything she had, knocking down the first infected that got too close. Behind her, the others fought with equal ferocity, using whatever they could to hold the line. It was chaos. The hallway became a battleground, with every step forward pushing the group closer to the front exit. Emma didn't have time to think, only to survive. They fought their way through, one step at a time, as the infected closed in from all sides. The noise was deafening, but Emma kept her focus. They had no choice now but to push forward. Finally, with one final, desperate push, the group reached the door. They burst into the open air, and the cool night wind hit Emma's face, her heart racing in her chest. They had made it. But the battle wasn't over. They had escaped the immediate threat, but the horde was still coming. They had to keep moving. Emma turned to the others. "We fight, or we run. But we don't stop." And with that, the final push began. The horde was relentless, but Emma was more determined than ever. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for their future. The cold night air filled their lungs as they stood outside the school, the shattered remnants of their last barricade still in the background. Emma's eyes scanned the horizon, her body tense and ready. She could feel the weight of the silence, the eerie calm before the storm. Behind them, the school, their fortress, was nothing more than a shell, a monument to their last hope, now abandoned in the chaos. The infected were close, too close. The group had managed to break through the front doors, but the horde was already closing in on them. They could see the twisted figures stumbling toward them, mindlessly driven by hunger. It was almost as if the night had conspired against them. Darkness thickened the air, making it harder to see, harder to breathe. "We can't stop here," Emma said, her voice a low command. Her eyes flickered to Coach Daniels, Jake, and the others, who were already gathering their weapons and preparing for the next wave. "Where do we go?" Lily asked, her voice strained. She was holding a bat, her knuckles white with tension. "There's nowhere left." Emma's eyes narrowed, her mind racing. They had no clear path. There were no more plans, just survival. "Head for the woods," Coach Daniels said, his voice grim but steady. "It's our only shot. The trees will give us cover. We can move quickly and lose them in the dark. We'll head north, toward the river. The bridge is the only place we might find a way out of here." The others nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. There was no choice. The infected were relentless, and they had nowhere else to turn. If they stayed here, they would be trapped. Emma gave a sharp nod. "We move fast, and we don't look back." With that, they turned, jogging as fast as they could toward the treeline at the edge of the school grounds. The darkness of the woods was both a shield and a threat, offering some cover from the infected but also hiding dangers of its own. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the soft earth beneath their shoes, but it didn't stop the gut-wrenching growls that echoed from behind them. The horde was right on their heels. "Stay close," Emma called over her shoulder, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could hear the infected's footsteps growing louder, their relentless pursuit more than a simple chase. It was an overwhelming force they couldn't outrun forever. The trees loomed ahead, their twisted branches silhouetted against the dark sky. As the group approached, they ducked beneath the canopy, their movements faster, more urgent. Emma's heart raced as she heard the first of the infected entering the woods. She didn't dare look back. Every instinct told her to keep moving. "How much further?" Jake gasped, his breath heavy with exhaustion. "Not far," Emma replied, her voice strained but determined. "Keep going. We're almost at the river." They pushed through the underbrush, the smell of decay and rot filling the air as they moved deeper into the forest. Emma could feel the sweat running down her back, the fear in her gut threatening to tear her apart. They were running on fumes now, barely holding on to hope. Suddenly, a screech broke through the air, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the woods behind them. Emma turned her head just enough to see one of the infected stumbling through the trees, its eyes vacant and wild. But then, to her horror, she saw more, dozens of them. The horde had found them. "No!" Emma shouted, turning to Coach Daniels. "We need to fight. We don't have time to outrun them." Coach Daniels looked at her, his face set with grim resolve. "We'll make a stand here. This is where we end this." The group skidded to a halt, pulling together and turning to face the approaching horde. The infected were closing in fast, but the trees offered them a bit of cover. Emma's hand tightened around the pipe she had taken from the school, her fingers digging into the cold metal. Her breath was coming in short bursts, and for the first time since all of this had begun, she felt the weight of the inevitable. The fight ahead might be their last. "On three," Coach Daniels said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "1, 2, 3. With a scream, Emma and the others rushed forward to meet the infected. Emma swung the pipe with all her strength, knocking the first creature down. It wasn't enough. The next one came at her, faster this time, its claws slashing at her face. She ducked just in time, pushing it away with a kick to its chest. "Keep moving!" Jake shouted, swinging his bat with precision, taking down 2 infected in one clean strike. The fight was frantic, brutal. There was no time for thinking, only for acting. They fought with everything they had, swinging their makeshift weapons with deadly accuracy. The infected kept coming, their numbers seeming endless. But the group held their ground. They were stronger than they realized. Each swing, each strike, was an act of defiance against the overwhelming odds they faced. Time seemed to slow as the battle raged on. Every movement, every breath, felt like a battle of its own. Emma fought as though her life depended on it, which it did. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, her hands raw from the impact of each blow. Her legs burned with exhaustion, but she pushed herself harder, fighting for the future she hadn't given up on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last of the infected fell to the ground, twitching in death. The group stood panting, covered in sweat and blood, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. The woods were quiet now, but the victory felt hollow. Emma looked around at the others. They were alive, but at what cost? The silence between them was thick with the weight of the moment. "We made it," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. But Emma wasn't so sure. The world they had known was gone. There would be no return to normalcy, no rescue. What was left of humanity? Was this fight truly worth it? Then, through the silence, Emma heard something. A distant sound, faint, but unmistakable. A helicopter. She turned to Coach Daniels, her eyes wide with realization. Maybe we're not alone after all. The group exchanged a look, a glimmer of hope sparking in their eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emma dared to believe there was still a chance.